Hello, one and all. Welcome to another edition of Heavy Hands. Phil, help. I can't control the cadence or pitch of my voice.
Why was that so unnecessarily spooky?
Welcome to Heavy Hands. Welcome to the show. We are here to talk to you about truly terrifying and ghoulish displays of violence which took place last weekend in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And aside from the normal kind of weekend violence that happens in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, this was sanctioned by the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Justin Gaethje knocked out Edson Barboza. Other stuff happened. But really the most important thing, Phil, is that we have a weekend off from the UFC schedule. It was going so well, too. You know, the schedule was so strong. There were so many good cards. And boy, these last three. It's like there's only so much you can do before the cynic in you starts to come back out. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, each one of these has had to kind of be saved by the main event. This one wasn't as guilty of that as like last week's one was.
No.
But it had a lot of simmering kind of decent fights in it that if you watched this card after a long drought, I think you would love it.
Yeah.
But at the end of the long schedule, it did feel like it was starting to drag a bit. It was basically the equivalent of Josh Emmett, Michael Johnson, whereas like last week's was the equivalent of Paul Craig against Paul Craig against Kenny Nzechukwu, where the incredible like last second finish couldn't salvage the horrible taste from everything that had come beforehand.
Last week the whole card was Craig Nzechukwu, no doubt. This was definitely better. But you know, I'm grateful to have a weekend off. UFC 236 is now 2 weeks away, and it looks okay for a pay-per-view. I mean, it's got two pretty damn enticing fights at the top, although you and I have our own particular reasons for feeling weirdly sad about it, which I'm sure we'll get into next week to make sure we're dampening everyone's spirits before what is objectively one of the most exciting events of the year so far. But, you know, this week, frankly, there's not enough on UFC 236 to have to do a full preview segment 2 weeks in advance. Not in my opinion. So we're going to talk to you today on this episode of Heavy Hands. This is Heavy Hands. Did I say that? I think it says it in the intro. So if you heard that, you know what you're listening to. We're going to talk to you about what happened last weekend in Philadelphia. Justin Gaethje, Edson Barboza, Jack Hermanson, Dave Branch, Josh Emmett, Michael Johnson. There were some very notable and interesting results. We are also going to dip into the heavy bag, and it feels like so long. In fact, I think it's been since, I don't know, December, January, since we last got to answer listener questions. So we're going to do that today as well. So if you have asked a question, if you are a $5 patron on the Heavy Hands Patreon and you've asked a question, finally, your patience will be rewarded in the third segment of today's show. Before we get into any of that, though, as promised, UFC Philly, Gaethje versus Barboza. Phil, does it make any more or less sense now, having seen how it played out, that Justin Gaethje was a slight underdog to Edson Barboza coming into this bout?
That was just weird.
Why?
It was just strange. Like, normally the odds makers are relatively on point when it comes to basic style matchups. Why would anyone look at Edson Barboza and think, this guy is going to have the answer to the most forward-moving fighter we've ever seen?
Yeah.
With the possible exception of, like, John Lineker.
Sure, yeah. It was one that I was so sure of that a lot of times what will happen is I'll make a pick, and then I'll just start second-guessing. And then people online will make the second guesses seem more valid because they will, you know, bring up all the reasons why they're picking the opposite of me. And for this one, the reasons I seem to be seeing most were, like, there were a lot of tactical things that Barboza likes to do that Gaethje has clearly struggled with in the past, right? So people, and I think you raised this as well on last week's episode, like people were talking about his predilection for body work. Obviously, a good tool to have against Justin Gaethje. People were talking about his kicking game, I guess. Like the low kicks, he can out low kick Gaethje, maybe was the idea. People were talking about his footwork. Like these are all things that Barboza does have skills. He has skills in these areas. But stylistically, this fight was designed for Edson Barboza to lose. And this is not to say that he didn't do what he could in this fight, as short as it was. It only lasted 2.5 minutes. It's hard to say Barboza was like doing anything badly. Like honestly, he was kind of throwing back jabs and combinations and moving his head a little better than he has in the past. You know, he was doing his damnedest to make the best of this style matchup. But right from the get-go, you see Edson Barboza and Justin Gaethje just trading leg kicks with each other, and you have to think, this is a Justin Gaethje fight. This is not how Barboza usually wants to fight people. When he wins, it's not because he trades power shots with someone else. That's never the reason for him winning. So, yeah, Justin Gaethje put pressure on Edson Barboza. I mean, what do you have to say about this performance, Phil? Some people were saying that Gaethje looks a little better, a little sharper, a little more patient, certainly, he was saying about himself. What do you? How do you rate his performance?
I think I would give that a qualified yes, because we've gone from pretty tough matchups for Justin Gaethje to much more forgiving ones in his last two fights.
Vic and Barboza far away from Poirier and Alvarez.
Yep. He's taken far less damage, and he's looked much more comfortable. But this is also, this is the whole Dos Santos-Rothwell dynamic, right? Suddenly, in comfortable style matchups, elements of your game will come to the fore because you can afford to kind of spend mental energy on them. If you're like, yes, I know exactly what to do in here. So he looked defensively more sound. I think it was, one of the more interesting things about this fight to me was that Gaethje did not immediately pressure in terms of moving forwards, right? It was that he just came out, established mid-range, and went for a leg kick battle.
That kind of surprised me. Yeah, he had pressure on Barboza, but he didn't immediately think, I have to back this guy up.
Yeah, so I think it was kind of pressure in terms of dictating terms. Because I think what we saw Barboza do a bit later on in the fight, when it was probably already too late, I think Barboza had sort of taught himself he was going to kick at Gaethje's lead leg as he stepped in. But Gaethje did not step forward. Gaethje just hung out at mid-range and was like, no, I'm going to kick your leg out first. And so I think that threw Barboza off and kind of drew him into the punching exchanges, which ended up being, the kind of the beginning of the end for him.
Yeah. Gaethje's defense has always been like serviceable enough, but it was interesting to see him like relying on it as a thing. You know what I mean? Like just waiting and reading strikes at range. Not that he was doing an amazing job of that, but then again, neither was Barboza. And the problem for Barboza in this fight was always going to be like, if he can move away, and then he's going to have a hard time firing while moving, or he can plant his feet and trade with Justin Gaethje. And no matter how well you trade, like he hit Gaethje with some big shots as Gaethje was going forward. On like 2 occasions, he hit him with some really clean punches to the head. But no matter how well you do that, like you're not Dustin Poirier or Eddie Alvarez. You have to plant your feet and stand in the pocket with this guy. You better be really good at it. And
it's one of the interesting things, right? Is that Edson Barboza is objectively a better fighter than, say, Anthony Pettis, but I would give Pettis more of a chance against Gaethje, despite the fact that he has even less kind of technical tools for solving the matchup than Barboza does, purely because Pettis is a really hard puncher. Like that was always going to be like one of the, you mentioned, so there were too many things which made this style matchup poisonous for Barboza. It was the fact that he's not a particularly powerful or durable puncher. He's not very active. He's not an active clinch fighter. He didn't have enough. Where was his safety zone? Where was his zone where he could hurt Gaethje? Was only if he could back Gaethje up. Yeah,
he had to stay. Yeah, the clinches. I'm glad you mentioned that because the clinch is a big thing. Like this is something I don't think we don't see a lot of in MMA because our concept of a style style matchup is still largely like striker versus grappler. A lot of people still think about it that way. And like those ideas of styles have to be blended for the boxing concept of styles. Like, in what direction do you like to move? How do you like to keep pressure on your opponent? And how do you take mental pressure off of yourself? You have to blend the phases together. And it's really, really important for all evasive boxers that they be able to step in and close the distance on their own terms. You cannot just retreat, because there is no way you can run backwards faster than the other guy can run forwards. And the harder you try to run backwards, the more and more difficult it becomes to punch off your back foot, which is already a pretty difficult skill to learn and perfect. So, like, yeah, what was Barboza going to do, man? Like, if you can't step into the clinch, then you're just getting chased. And that's how Barboza loses, is when he can't stop the other guy chasing him. You can't knock them out, and you can't close the distance yourself. You have no choice but to just retreat. And it's even the best defensive evasive fighters. They do not win fights purely by retreating. You just can't do it. You have to pick your spots to engage. You have to pick your spots to smother. And if you can't smother, especially, you're kind of fucked. So,
I will say this is probably one of the cases where Aldo is actually almost. This is probably one of Aldo's greatest areas of weakness. He's not a tremendous clinch fighter. He's not active. He doesn't tend to do much from the clinch at all. It's one of the things that has led to, it's one of the reasons why he struggled with Holloway, is that he couldn't stop exchanges on those terms, because he generally just stiff arms people out and goes back to circling and moving away. But Aldo is also, as you need at least one of these things. He's a really hard puncher.
Yes.
And Barboza isn't one of those things. So you mentioned kind of the broad brush style matchups that people think of, and I think that probably goes back to the why Barboza was the favorite thing, because I suspect this is our old friend of flashy striker only loses to wrestlers. The whole like Pettis thing that we saw for a while or Uriah Hall, or it would be like, he lost these matchups, but it was just due to the wrestling. Mm-hmm. And especially because Barboza had 2 losses to big powerful wrestlers, and had then beaten a striker that people were just thinking, and he's just super technical. He's just super technical. How is Gaethje going to beat him? He's so technical.
Yeah, like I was also on the side of, I would like to see Gaethje employ some wrestling here, which he did some clinch work. I mean, that was a smart idea. But the question is, like, why was Barboza getting out wrestled by those dudes? He wasn't walking into reactive takedowns. You know what I'm saying? There's a big difference between you coming forward and the other guy taking you down, and the other guy, you just can't get him off of you. And that's really, that's Barboza's problem, is the pressure. So let's move on, shall we? There were some other notable things on this card. Not much to say about Jack Hermanson versus David Branch, but that was surprising. I believe Jack Hermanson was a favorite, another weird line, but he certainly vindicated that, because he came out and submitted renowned Renzo Blasey, renowned Renzo Blasey black belt.
That would explain it. If he was a black belt under Hendo Blasey, the far more stoned branch of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu greats. Now we know why.
Also, as far as his name goes, he doesn't seem to be related to the Gracies, so I don't know if there's much of a lineage there at all. But yes, David Branch's black belt being called into question aside, Jack Hermanson came out and immediately submitted him with that. I need to come up with a good, consistent term for this. I keep calling it a Schultz headlock style guillotine, but we have increasingly seen this submission in MMA. Going back, the first example I can think of is Pat Curran over Shabulat Shamalayev. He transitioned from the back to a deep arm-in guillotine. But Pedro Munoz has also hit one in the UFC. I think Ryan Bader hit one on Matyushenko, if I'm recalling correctly. It's a cool move. And it's one of those moves that, like, when it's locked in, you're kind of done. It's really, really difficult to wriggle out. If it's like a secured arm triangle. Like, you can grit your way through it probably, but once it's in, you're not really escaping that hold.
Yeah, he had like a weird inverted seatbelt position. He had because he was upside down on his back with his with his arm over his chest and his other one round his back, and then you could see Branch being like, "Oh yeah, I'm pretty sure I know what to do here. He's not going to be taking my back anytime soon, so I just slip him off and oh no."
Yep.
And that was kind of it.
Yeah.
I think it was a good performance for Hermanson, and we were talking about this before the show. He is a weird example of a guy who is really bad against southpaws and like a completely different fighter against orthodox fighters.
Hugely dangerous and aggressive against orthodox fighters, and yeah, like weirdly like a kitten nullified against southpaws. So we say he came out super aggressive against David Branch, but like I'm pretty sure Thiago Santos fought him largely from southpaw and confused him a lot. But the one that really stands out in my mind was that fight against Cesar Ferreira, where he came into the UFC, had a great fight with Scott Askham, outboxed him. I was like, all right, I love this dude. And then he fought Cesar Ferreira, and I was going to say everything went away, but really what went away was his jab. He is more so than most fighters, like you said, really, really reluctant to let his jab go against southpaws, and most of his offense seems to flow off of like how comfortable he is landing his jab or how much he feels like he could land his jab. Like his concept of positioning against southpaws just seems to evaporate. He never feels like he's in position to let a strike go. And it's weird. It's really weird. And I don't know. Like, could we make a lot of money just betting on Jack Hermanson except for when he fights lefties?
Yeah. He can be like he's like a modern day Nate Marquardt. Just like whenever he's up against southpaw, just be like, no, he ain't gonna do shit.
Yeah.
And then, although he has beaten some southpaws. I mean, Askham is a southpaw, which is weird. But then again, he is also quite a weirdly inactive southpaw himself a lot of the time. And I think Hermanson beat him up in the clinch quite a lot.
He did, yeah. A lot of right uppercuts inside.
Yeah. And he did at least beat Laters, but that was more sort of getting in trouble and then Laters being somewhat shot. Yeah,
and getting really tired, and then also Hermanson being shockingly good on the ground.
Yeah, and incredibly gutsy.
Yes. Yeah, the gutsiness, man, that has been playing out. What happened last week that was an example? Like, there was Felder, Charles Oliveira was a very gutsy anti-grappler performance. I swear last week there was an example of something similar. It was... Oh, God, last week's card was so bad. I'm just looking it over again. It was so bad.
It was bad. No, I can't remember. I cleansed it from my mind.
Yeah. Leon Edwards, Gunnar Nelson from the week before.
Yes. There we go.
Another example of somebody just being really comfortable and then just beating the shit out of the grappler while they're on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Ground and pound, still a game changer for people who are mainly submission artists on the floor. It really is. Your belt color does seem to degrade with each hard elbow you take to the temple. So that's all there really is to say about Hermanson Branch. And there's plenty of other stuff on this card to talk about, but why don't we take a quick break? When we come back, we will talk about Josh Emmett's comeback knockout win over Michael Johnson. We'll talk about Sadiq Yusuf, the unfortunate, the extremely good prospect who is, yes, unfortunately tied to Lloyd Irvin, but he had a really unexpected win over Shane Morais. It's like a huge feather in his cap. And more besides. Kevin Aguilar, Enrique Barzola, Michelle Waterson, Carolina Kowalkiewicz. There were fights, and we're going to talk about them after this.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
Welcome back to Heavy Hands. We are still talking about UFC Philadelphia, aka UFC Gaethje versus Barboza. Next one up, going in chronological order, as we love to do. Just the laziest and most unoriginal way to organize this discussion. Featherweights, Josh Emmett and Michael Johnson. Phil, do you care to say what you said to me before about how you feel about Josh Emmett, or is that for private discussion only?
I just kind of don't like Josh Emmett. Like, I'm sure he's a good dude.
There's no reason to personally dislike him that I have seen so far.
No, I just find him really annoying to watch. I couldn't quite put my finger on why that is, and this seems like a terrible thing to say. Might be because I just get this strange impression from watching his fights that he thinks that he's better than he is.
Can I say, this fight would bear that suspicion out for the first 2 rounds. This is interesting. I said this on Twitter last week. I was like, is this a mirror match? These two dudes are like two versions of the same guy, right? And a lot of people vehemently disagreed. And I guess, like, that's a pretty vague statement. So there's many grounds in which you could say, like, I don't know. There's probably at least one of those people who was like, what? One of these guys is white. How could they be the same guy? But, you know, like, there are many different ways. You'd be like, well, Emmett prefers this punch and Johnson prefers this punch. One's an orthodox, one's a southpaw. One throws more kicks, whatever. But, like, the reason I said that was these are two fighters who mostly succeed because they're great athletes. They're really fast. They're really powerful. And that's like the defining characteristic of Michael Johnson's career. And so far, Josh Emmett's much younger career, just really quick, massive power in his hands. And both of these guys have run into consistent problems for similar reasons, which is that they become predictable. Like, they rely so much on their speed and their power, they don't have the creativity or the technical variety to disguise those punches. So the speed throws you off, but once you get used to the speed, their opponents tend to kind of figure out their timing and start to give them problems. So that was what I was talking about when I said that. And this is an interesting matchup from that perspective, because I think we have seen in the last 2 or 3 fights substantial technical growth out of Michael Johnson. Like, he looks more than ever like a veteran striker. We've seen better defense, better footwork, slower pace, really, really good counters, which Johnson has always been an underrated counterpuncher, and it's often where he gets his most devastating shots off or off the back foot. But we saw also like really interesting rhythm and feints from Michael Johnson in this fight. He was doing all the subtle in-between things that you want to see an experienced fighter do. And I picked Michael Johnson going into this fight because I viewed it as essentially a mirror match, and I'm going to pick the guy with more experience because he's going to have a better idea of just basically how to keep things interesting and how to change things up. And Michael Johnson, more than ever, looked like he was capable of fighting that kind of fight here. But Josh Emmett, he lost the first 2 rounds exactly as I expected him to lose them, and then Josh Emmett adjusted and changed up his approach in a much more subtle way going into the 3rd round. And I like that. It's a sign of growth from him. The stuff that you're talking about, like he's not as good as he thinks he is, I understand that impression. It's an extremely callous and cruel way to say it, and how dare you. But like, I think the reason for that is, like, a lot of his moves, it's kind of amateur hour shit. It's like the kind of stuff that would surprise and dazzle someone who, like, you're the first hard-hitting fighter they've ever faced, you know, and they're inexperienced, they're not sure, and so you start doing these crazy switch steps, and you're like, it's the kind of shit that would have worked against UFC level fighters in 2004, you know, like, it looks very much like Uriah Faber footwork, which is not surprising because Emmett's a team alpha male fighter, but it's not subtle. It all happens from far away. It's like a big move, and it's like the Winklejohn problem. Like, if you just, like, I don't have to fall for that move. I can just move away and you still can't hit me, you know? So, like, that's kind of is that kind of what gives you that impression? Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's because it's tons of razzle dazzle, but for absolutely no reason.
Yes,
and then he will go into orthodox. He'll like stance switch and shuffle and fake 2 level changes, and then just go into orthodox and just jump and do a big right hand.
Yeah,
and like it's just tons of razzle dazzle dressing up an incredibly basic game.
He looks like Uriah Faber is his boxing coach.
It's not even it's not generally even functional razzle dazzle, because like you said, he's generally from miles away.
Yeah, and it wasn't working against Michael Johnson, but he did adjust. I mean, you want to talk about his adjustments in the third round? Because again, it's notable for a guy whose problem has been that he cannot adjust in the past.
Yeah, I mean, so what we saw from him was that he stopped actually trying to just sprint in.
Yeah,
he realized, I can't just fake this guy out by doing feints from 6 feet away and then jumping at him. I'm going to have to force exchanges deeper. So he started actually, of all things, he started using his jab. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure I've ever seen him. It's not the world's greatest jab, but it gave Michael Johnson something to think about.
Mm-hmm.
And he started throwing away punches as well.
Yes.
He would step into range and he would throw his punch, but he wouldn't actually load up on it. So that when Johnson came back with a counter, because Johnson is always likely to try and discourage someone when they step into the pocket against him, he's pathologically incapable of not doing that.
Mm-hmm.
He was actually by the third round, he was in position to fire back.
Yeah. He started taking the steam off of his punches, which again is notable for someone whose main thing is hitting really hard and being really fast to just slow down and ease up and throw some shots away to initiate the exchange and then figure out how to solve it. And the last exchange, I thought was a pretty good setup. Josh Emmett comes in with a double pump feint. He feints high with a jab, and then he feints a jab to the body as he actually commits himself to the pocket. And as far as I can tell, it looks like Johnson is expecting a right hand to the body that he has been, dealing with for a good portion of the fight up to that point. And instead, it is an overhand right on the chin. And this is the reason a body jab overhand right is a classic combination. It works well. And especially when you feint that body jab and then you add another feint before that, Michael Johnson was having a harder and harder time reacting. And he was losing the third round. I mean, it was still competitive, but I thought Emmett very clearly lost the first 2. And then, turned it around in really impressive fashion. So is it possible he could redeem himself in your eyes, Phil?
No.
Very high expectations. If he fought more like he did in that third round from the get-go, I mean, you'd have to like him, right? Because the only unless you're... I mean, do you have other reasons for disliking him, Phil?
You calling me a racist?
I mean, I didn't want to say it, but
you're saying that I have some kind of irrational prejudice towards bricked up dudes who look like they should be, cast members of Fury Road.
Yeah, guys who look like Vikings extras. But yeah, it was a hell of a fucking comeback, to say the least. And we don't talk about this stuff on the show very often, but and in fact, earlier, Phil, you said you're glad he didn't get the knockout of the night bonus. But I want to say he deserved it, all right? Justin Gaethje already gets paid more than Josh Emmett. And the UFC literally always gives. If 2 of a similar impressive thing happen on a card, whoever's higher up on the card is going to get the bonus, which is just the opposite of how it should work. And anyway, we shouldn't have bonuses in the first place. So, Michelle Waterson, Karolina Kowalkiewicz, your take on this fight?
Michelle Waterson has really been surprising me lately.
Yeah.
She's this is the second performance she's had, which is the first one against Felice Herrig. That's fine. This one against Karolina Kowalkiewicz, even a tougher style matchup for her, and she sold it really well, and not in a hugely technically functional way, but in how she deployed her skills. Like, let me sort of unpack that a bit. She is probably still like a lesser puncher and fights at a kind of instinctively slightly lower pace than Kowalkiewicz, but she did an amazing job of kind of utilizing what her best advantages were. That she was much faster, she was more athletic, and she's a better grappler. And we kind of saw that come out in phases, because the first round it was all about lateral movement, because Kowalkiewicz is something of a plodder, and she just kind of had to follow Waterson around, and Waterson was able to pick her off with just kicks and punches and keep moving.
Do you think Carolina's become more of a plodder?
No, I think she's been figured out more. I think is just the honest answer. I think that just people have started to realize, she's good in area X and she's good in area, and she's bad in area Y, and she's starting to get scouted a bit. People are realizing she's a bit slow on her feet. She's not the hardest puncher, and she's got deficiencies in her takedown game. But the thing is, if Waterson had run that striking, she won the first round off her striking. If she'd done that the whole fight, I think she just would have gotten worn down. I think you saw in the second round, Waterson was starting to lose it as Kowalkiewicz's pressure mounted up. And then Waterson just turned it around with, of all things, a head and arm throw. She's one of the few people in MMA who was actually like genuinely really good at that technique. And then she just had really tight top position, and by the third round rolled around, Kowalkiewicz was kind of panicking. She was overcommitted. She had to pressure. She had to get a finish which she's not capable of getting, and so she had to overcommit on her forward pressure. So yeah, I just thought it was a really smart performance. Like, we're not going to see huge technical leaps from Michelle Waterson, but what we are seeing from her is just her deploying the parts of her skill set at exactly the right times.
It's good game planning, really.
Yeah.
I don't know how much of it was premeditated, but seemingly all of it was, because, Michelle Waterson's style hasn't really drastically changed. Her bag of tricks has not changed dramatically. As you said, even here in her late stage of her career where she's putting on these good performances, she's still hitting that fucking head and arm throw as like her primary takedown. And there are lots of reasons to critique that kind of technique. There are lots of reasons to critique her kick-based striking style and the fact that she only ever throws one strike at a time. I can still see in this matchup all the reasons I picked Karolina Kowalkiewicz, but Waterson, within the parameters of her style, just fought a really intelligent fight. And, I like that. Do you want to see Michelle Waterson get a title shot?
No.
Yeah.
I kind of should.
I want to see her just go up to flyweight and fight Valentina. That sounds more interesting than whatever's happening in that division anyway.
Yeah, I mean, there's just some matchups where I think they're just instinctively going to be hugely problematic for her.
Yeah.
I mean, we saw her get physically overwhelmed by Tisha Torres, and we've seen Tisha Torres get physically overwhelmed by Jessica Andrade and Weili Zhang. Like, there's just a hard physical ceiling which Michelle Waterson is going to hit at some point. I mean, I'd like to see her fight, say, like Randa Marcos. She's been putting together some a relatively decent run of late, right? I know she had the draw against Rodriguez, I think it was. But
first round submission of Hill is pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I want to be clear. I don't actually want to see Michelle Waterson fight Valentina Shevchenko because if getting overpowered is a consistent problem in your career, I mean, we saw what Val did to my girl Joanna. So, but yeah, I also enjoy seeing, like, also it has to be said, the opposite of the Josh Emmett problem and why it's so hard for you to enjoy his improvements. Michelle Waterson's a very likable person, so she seems like a sweetheart. So it's easy to enjoy her figuring out how to make her style work against difficult style matchups. All right, the one you've all been waiting for, of course. Let's talk about Paul Craig let's talk about Sadiq Yusuf versus
Let's
Shimon
talk
Morais.
briefly about Paul Craig Kennedy Nzechukwu, because I hear that you didn't pick that fight correctly. That you didn't pick experience, and
I should have picked.
Is there any outside influence or perhaps person you would like to blame for this?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Phil. In fact, there is. One Zane Simon. Have you heard of him?
I have.
Unfortunately,
I've heard that he is a monster.
He is one of history's greatest monsters, or just a real shitheel. And he convinced me somehow that Paul Craig was not going to rely on his experience, was not going to fight a smart fight, and was in fact going to lose to the more athletic, much larger, more powerful, up-and-coming fighter. And now that I say it, he was right. But then Paul Craig got a triangle in the last 30 seconds. So
yeah, it would have been one of, like, picking Craig honestly would have been a bad pick that happened to work out.
Yes, it really would have been. I still feel Zane made the right call. And yeah, it was Kennedy Nzechukwu who made the wrong call. Let's be real. But that's what Paul Craig does. How about Sadiq Yusuf though? Again, I only because I'm so enthusiastic about him do I feel I have to so constantly mention that he is a Lloyd Irvin team member. Very disappointing. But you can see why I'm conflicted, right? Because, like, we were both pretty excited about him fighting Shimon Morais. We're like, probably too much too soon. But, man, what a fight. And Yusuf looks like a fighter, comfortable and skilled way beyond his years. And all of that's still true, except Sadiq Yusuf beat Shimon Morais, which is crazy. Like, it's a massive step up in competition for him to fight someone who's similarly athletic, considerably more violent and aggressive, probably better on the ground as a submission artist. I mean, it's hard to say. But, like, Shimon Morais is a dangerous dude. And just having been there, having been in wars and never being stopped, like, that's a huge challenge to take on as a 6-0 fighter. And Sadiq Yusuf fucking beat him. I mean, were you as blown away by that result as I was?
Yeah, this was amazingly impressive. And not just due to him winning, it was because it was in a closely contested decision, which was competitive throughout. You know, it would have been one thing for him to, like, Hernandez Dariush him,
sure,
where you're expecting, like, if there's one way this guy's going to win, it's by coming out and fucking this guy up right out of the bat. But no, he won a close decision by, in part, showing some skills that he hasn't really shown before. Like, I think in a lot of his previous fights, he's been someone who has needed to get, like, his hands on someone before he's felt comfortable with the range. He's had a lot of kind of early clinches being a necessity in his fights. Mm-hmm. He'll just sort of, you know, hold guys against the cage and then move back out and then feel like, okay, yeah, I think I've kind of felt, you know, how this guy moves and how he feels. Wasn't necessary here. He's been a bit of a boxer, but he kind of, in shades of the main event, you know, he kind of leg kicked Shimon Morais at the beginning. It was the first thing he did was, you know, we're going to be fencing at range, and I'm going to be the one who establishes the leg kick threat early. Mm-hmm.
A lot of front kicks to the body too. Nice body kicks down the middle.
Yeah, which is one of Shimon Morais' kind of primary techniques.
Sure.
And he used it against him.
It was the fact that as a 6-0 fighter, he came out and he beat Shimon Morais by successfully adjusting to his adjustments. Like, he beat the more experienced guy in the way the experienced guy is supposed to win.
It was also very, very close, and it did come down to basically one mistake from Shimon Morais, which was going back to the well on his step-in elbow a few too many times. Mm-hmm. I think Morais probably would have won without that. But other than that, you know, you can't, you know, MMA is such a high variance sport that it's very difficult to you know, you can't make those kind of claims. You can't say, well, he would have won if not for this. Mm-hmm. I mean, but it's just the fact, like, even if he had lost it still would have been tremendously impressive.
Yeah. He still came out. He showed that he doesn't have to back up and counter. He showed that he doesn't have to tie up with somebody and connect with them, as you said. He put intelligent distance pressure on a more experienced kickboxer from the beginning, and then successfully found counters to the move that caused basically the one idea, the intercepting elbows that caused him to lose the second round and turned the momentum back in his favor. Like, that's a lot for a 6-0 fighter. So yeah, again, fuck Lloyd Irvin, but
he's also a guy where I feel like a lot of times when you see guys come from the regional circuit and they come into the UFC, you see them sort of hit the athleticism barrier and their ability to finish people goes down. To me, he looks like a fighter who is going to get much better at finishing people over time. Like, he looks like someone who's going to be, like, who is making sure he hits people right rather than hits people, like, as hard as he possibly can.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily want to, like, oversell some of the technical elements of this fight. I think it was probably the best fight of the card overall in terms of the exchanges, kind of how deep it went, how I think it was most interesting from a defensive perspective, and I think that's one of these guys both still tend to swing pretty hard on their punches, but there was just a lot of defensive responsibility on both ends. Like, that's kind of the Shaman Morais classic in particular, is that he's got good defense, but when he's decided that it's his turn, he will often just, like, sell out.
Yeah.
So there was a reasonable amount of that, but, you know, again, there was kind of less of that from Yusuf. I don't know why, I get the impression that he is going to become more threatening as time goes by. You know, he's going to get better at finishing people, and because I don't get the impression that he is at heart a wild puncher. He was doing that because Shaman Morais because he's still developing, and because Shaman Morais is a very scary person to have to exchange with.
Yeah, no kidding. I think it's like he's clearly a great athlete and a hard hitter, but like his defining asset right now are his eyes. Like seeing both on defense and offense, he really, really had the appearance of picking and choosing his shots, even in counters in the midst of exchanges. He was placing them carefully, choosing the right punches, stringing them together, head, body, all that stuff. Like, unfortunately, beating Shaman Morais here may doom him to a pretty quick prospect loss against a different style matchup. But that's how things tend to work in the UFC, especially in deep divisions like featherweight. But
yeah, I think they'll Hernandez him, which means they'll move him sideways for one fight and then hyper accelerate him if he wins it.
Probably. But if they need to move him sideways, they could have him fight the next guy I want to talk about, Kevin Aguilar, who fought one of my all-time faves, Enrique Barzola. Super underrated El Fuerte. Very difficult, high pace, great takedowns, good ground and pound, just really frustrating and exhausting to fight. And once again, this happened in Kevin Aguilar's UFC debut against Rick Glenn. I was like, well, this dude he literally got knocked out in a brawl with Leonard Garcia. So, like, why the fuck would I pick him against Rick Glenn? And then he looked okay against Rick Glenn. I was like, okay, well, he was able to time Glenn with counters. Like, that's how Glenn loses. That's how he lost to Miles Jury. And the fact that Aguilar is just a more powerful counterpuncher means he didn't have to be all that sharp to make that work against a slow, always coming in fighter like Rick Glenn. So I picked against him again, against Enrique Barzola here. And once again, I was impressed by how well he did. Kevin Aguilar fought a very good fight against Enrique Barzola and has quickly revealed himself to be my featherweight Al Iaquinta, I also would compare it to like Danny Garcia in boxing. Like, boxing fans hate Danny Garcia for all kinds of justifiable reasons. Like, he cherry picks his opponents and fights really outmatched competition way more often than he should. But I think another thing is really that it's kind of frustrating to watch him because it's hard to tell why he's so successful. And the answer is, like, he's just kind of good at everything. He's just kind of technically fine at everything. And at least in terms of boxing skill, much like Al Iaquinta, I can pick apart the boxing of Kevin Aguilar, but he looks like a very well-schooled boxer. His footwork was sharp. His counterpunches were sharp. He was varied and creative with his combinations, and he was frequently throwing in combination. Also very effective with his jab. He just fought basically entirely a disciplined boxing performance while shucking off every takedown that Enrique Barzola attempted.
Yeah, I mean, he's just much better than he looks. I mean, I think the footwork was really the key for him because he took like short steps, never got out of stance, but was still able to kind of move backwards whenever Barzola came forwards, and he had a very good understanding of where his range was. Mm-hmm. So Barzola, I saw some complaints that Barzola didn't shoot on him enough, but Barzola was simply never in range.
Yeah, I mean, he had to force every
shot.
shot.
Yeah, partially this is because Barzola he's just not a very big featherweight,
right,
and he's not tremendously explosive either. But it was just the fact that he would move forward and Aguilar would move backwards and would then just punch him really hard as soon as he came forward. And there was no point when Aguilar was moving backwards that he wasn't able to punch Barzola moving forwards. He was never going into the whole JDS or Barboza, I'm just going to start scooting away at maximum speed thing. He was always prepared to fire back.
And that's a great look, especially in comparison to Barboza. Aguilar, for his weight, looks like a much more effective puncher than Edson Barboza is. And yet it's Barboza, who should be the quick, light outside mover at kicking range, who has to plant his feet and stop moving for several seconds at a time if he wants to answer his opponent's aggressive offense. And yet Aguilar, the hard-hitting guy you would expect to just plant his feet and slug with his opponent, does a really he's got a great boxer shuffle where he's still kind of in his stance, but just really easily bouncing and moving, gliding backwards and to the side, sidestepping as his opponent comes forward, and he's always in position to just come in with a jab and then keep that up again. And again, it stands out because like Gaethje against Barboza, obviously some differences, but Barzola was putting a ton of pressure on Aguilar in this fight. He was super aggressive from the very beginning. And Aguilar's footwork made it so that was not a problem. And then, the defensive wrestling was good too. But yeah, Kevin Aguilar, man, I'm going to have my eye on him going forward because he has surprised me twice, and I have badly underrated him twice in a row.
I will shout out to El Fuerte's heart as well, though, because he actually turned that fight around a bit in the third round. He
found the left hook in combination, and he's a beast, dude. I love Enrique Barzola. It was just too little too late, but he did everything he could to turn that around.
Yeah, I think he couldn't have done that earlier.
No.
He simply couldn't have. That was simply a factor of him being a hyper gritty guy with a literally endless gas tank that he was able to just pour punches and kicks and walk through Aguilar until he could get to him kind of thing. It was just, it was Enrique Barzola being his own, incredibly gutsy self. But yeah, really impressive stuff from Aguilar.
As I said on Twitter, pretty much everyone who fights Barzola gets Barzola'd in the third round. No shame whatsoever. Do we have to say anything about Kevin Holland's fight with Gerald Meerschaert before we move on to segment 3? We're already kind of long on this segment, but it would be a crime if we didn't at least mention him, right?
It was amazing. I want all Kevin Holland's fights to be like this, and they always are.
Yes.
If Justin Gaethje and Kevin Holland have never let us down.
It's true. Yeah, very reliable. Kevin Holland fought the dumbest possible fight you can fight against Gerald Meerschaert. He made all of the wrong decisions. And then at the end, he had the gall to complain about Gerald Meerschaert not wanting to stand and bang with him. But it was Kevin Holland who kept grappling Meerschaert.
You remember the third round where he just came out and just immediately took Meerschaert down and then dove into a guillotine? I think then got swept. Amazing.
Yeah.
He just came to freaking hump me, man. all the guillotines he went for without where he'd just leave his hips in some meaningless place. He wouldn't either try and, use them to get he wouldn't push them forward to get leverage on the guillotine, and he wouldn't push them back so that he could control Mearshot's body. He'd just be like, "Yeah, I've got your neck now."
I don't know that Kevin Holland has hips. I think his legs might just go up through his trunk and connect to his shoulders, because the same applies to his wrestling defense. Like, spread your fucking legs out, dude. Like, he just stands there. But he's so relaxed and so ridiculous. It works. I don't know if he deserved this decision over Gerald Mearshart, but I'm so happy he got it. Kevin Holland, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm not sure either. Like, I scrolled through that fight afterwards, like getting to some other stuff, and I was like, wow, he really spent a lot of time on his back. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think I figured out his takedown defense, though. He's being a slinky. Like, slinky's a pretty difficult takedown, right?
Somebody throws Kevin Holland on his head, and he just rebounds and lands on his feet on the opposite side of the cage.
Yeah.
Man, if only
that
fights...
pretty much happened at one point in this fight.
Yeah, he cartwheeled his way out of a takedown, or kind of, and then got taken down anyway. Let's just say the middleweight division is lucky that UFC fights are not contested on a long flight of stairs, because Kevin Holland would be undefeated. Beautiful shit from the Smack Man, and that is now going to be his nickname going forward. I'm 100% certain he called himself the Smack Man in the post-fight interview, and it's beautiful. He's a warrior poet.
So make him sound like a drug dealer,
yes.
But you know, it's a much better name than Trailblazer.
Yeah, Smackman. I mean, yeah, it's memorable. For say what you will, but okay, Kevin Holland. We just had to talk about him a little bit. Let's take a break. When we come back, heavy bag questions from you, our listeners and patrons. After this,
financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
Okay, welcome back. Segment 3 here, and we are talking to you about some questions from our listeners. I think we have 4 or 5 heavy bag questions to get through, and we could use even more. If you are a $5 patron on the Heavy Hands Patreon, submit those questions. Also, if you are at the $1 level or above and you want to get into our private Slack chat, do that as well, and I will send you an invite. Let's see. Our first question here comes to us from Ian. Ian, who is a $5 contributor to the Heavy Hands Patreon. He asks, defense, why is it so hard to train in fighters? And he adds, I'm asking specifically from an MMA perspective here. I'm a Thai boxer, and the defensive tricks and styles you get away with when just striking are much more vast than when I'm getting my ass kicked by MMA guys. His 2 examples, someone who relied on a kickboxing style of defense in MMA and got beat up for it was Overeem. He also points to Brian Ortega, who obviously boxes, this is a quote, with some probably pretty decent boxers, and clearly boxes like a boxer. When he spars them, the shoulder roll Philly shell just doesn't work super well against them nasty 4 ounces. So defense, why is it so hard to train in MMA fighters? Why is there seemingly such a deficit of good technical defense in MMA? Any ideas?
It's a combination of things, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Firstly, it's that the best way of training defense, the best way of training for anything, and this is going to seem incredibly reductive, is to do that thing. Like training boxing defense for boxing, training kickboxing defense, boxing defense for MMA, kickboxing defense for MMA. It's never going to be the same as training MMA for MMA.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is sort of, it seems reductive, but you'll often get this idea that like certain a certain sport or a certain like aspect is somehow inherently deeper than another one, but instead these are all just kind of they all tend to be kind of just defined by human potential, which is either limitless or limited depending on how you look at it. So the best way to train defense for MMA is just MMA itself, and that is hard because there's just a lot of stuff to think about. I mean, that's sort of the problem, which has meant that because the small ounce gloves make it hard to block and parry, it means that everything has a very high risk to it, which means that people are also disincentivized from training defense in MMA, because you will get, if you have a style which leads you to kind of try out lots of things defensively in MMA, there's often a chance like that's going to get you hurt quite badly. Mm-hmm. Like if you think of guys like Robbie Lawler and so on, who are confident, or maybe Shane Burgos, for example, is someone who I would describe as a young fighter with good defense who is extremely confident in it. Mm-hmm. He takes a lot of strikes. Yep. Because he's very confident in his defense, working as defense to build his offense. So I would say it's basically just that there's lots of things to figure out, and the chance for them ending the fight or hurting you badly is very, very high. So it means that a lot of what we see prioritized as defense in MMA tends to be extremely low percentage stuff involving standing miles away. You know, it's not active defense. It tends to be, you know, the classics of what we think of as technical MMA, where it's, you know, in inverted commas, where it's people dancing around from miles away or not committing to anything. And people, wow, how'd you get in on this guy? That's how MMA has evolved those kind of things, because it's so very hard to get the basics down. Yeah,
I have to agree with all that. I would just add a couple things, like, right off the bat, the number of options available to an MMA fighter, even more than, like, already, I think you see more of a reliance on, more of a desire to have a one-size-fits-all defense in kickboxing than you do in boxing. Right? In boxing, there are a lot more subtle defensive specialists because they have to deal with relatively few offensive options. Like, if you want to be really, really reductive, like here's a way to train defense for boxing. Like, I've seen people do this out of that crab or Philly shell position, and they call it the box. Right? You basically have the right hand can either go high or low, and the left hand can either go high or low. And then you have shots down the middle. So you only need like really two answers on either side to be protected from the vast majority of things that are going to be coming at you. And it just becomes a matter of timing and getting comfortable, being confident in your defenses when you see those things coming, making those decisions on the fly. Kickboxing, there are more options. There are kicks, plus all the shit you can do in boxing, and oftentimes there's clinch, knees, elbows, and things as well. So immediately, I think we see a much stronger trend in that sport of people like Overeem, as was pointed out, as Ian pointed out, that they want a one-size-fits-all defense. There's too many options to have to make those split-second decisions, and so you want to fight behind a high guard. And then you get to MMA, and there's even more options. You have to worry about all the shit kickboxers worry about, tons of shit kickboxers would never be dumb enough to try, and then all the wrestling threats as well. And then you have the added problem of the one-size-fits-all defense at the high guard doesn't work because, not as well anyway, because the gloves are smaller and you can't be as passive with that defense. So it demands more activity if you're going to be in the pocket. And so, yeah, the one-size-fits-all defense for MMA is just standing far enough away that the other person can't get to you. They can't set up a takedown. They can't land a strike. And then you end up in this kind of weird striking style we see a lot of in MMA, where like all the karate dudes who can't make it in kickboxing suddenly have a home where they're fighting everyone who's just stuck at their range. But we are seeing, I think, more guys now with much better defensive options. And I think I think some people are just kind of accepting the hard lesson that if you want to be a good defensive fighter in MMA, you can't have a one-size-fits-all defense. Like, distance is it. It's the only thing that works in boxing and kickboxing and MMA, right? And then you get to kickboxing, and suddenly only distance and a high guard are one-size-fits-all things. And then you get to MMA, and the high guard isn't so good anymore either. So all you have that will defend you from pretty much everything is distance. And then, as we see in the metagame these days, more and more of your opponents are figuring out how to take that distance away from you. So I think people, like we saw with Sadiq Yusuf against Shimon Morais, like, they are understanding that they have to come into range and actively respond and then answer the threats that are coming at them. I think maybe what we're going to see is more counterpunching as the real next step in MMA defense, is being able to quickly answer and dissuade someone from continuing to use that weapon against you, because answering offense in layers with defense is even more difficult in MMA. So maybe, that's Yusuf did that really well against Morais, was just ready to respond right away every time. And the longer you try to guess what your opponent's going to do and respond, the more and more time a good opponent has to figure out ways around your defense. But it's just categorically difficult in MMA. I would say, though, your one example, Ian, of Brian Ortega, like, I think his defense is all right. Even by MMA standards. Like, his problem in his last fight was that he was fighting Max fucking Holloway. But otherwise, like, I still think there's a ton of value in training boxing defense. Like, there is boxing defense, karate defense. Like, these are still arts that have a lot to teach mixed martial artists in terms of developing that kind of defense. And you probably do want to have defense that isn't just standing really far away. Because otherwise your options for how you can fight are really, really limited. So
yeah. When I said, like, the best thing to train is, the sport itself, I definitely would, but I'd still definitely sign off on what you said there, because I think, as we see the sport get chopped down, become more finely grained and subtler, I think hands still remain the first thing that you have to get through. Mm-hmm. The lowest risk, the lowest risk kind of way to crack open an opponent. It's always
least taxing, closest to the target.
Yeah. Yep. Least compromising of your own mobility, mm-hmm. unlike things like kicks. It's always going to be the first thing you go to. So training stuff like boxing, learning the lessons from it, always going to be valuable.
And if you're going to be a long range fighter, like, there's a lot of value in learning shit from karate as well. And I would say, like, I would only alter your statement by saying the best way to learn striking defense is to train things like boxing and karate. The best way to learn to apply it in MMA is to train MMA. You are not going to be comfortable using those skills in an MMA context unless that is how you actually put them to use, is by training against someone who can do whatever they want at any moment, and you have to defend it.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, Ian, for that question. Our next one comes to us from Tef, from Myanmar. And Tef asks, let's see. Gosh, your guys' questions are so long. Okay. After hearing your breakdown of Alvarez Poirier 2, where you both classified Eddie as an anti-brawler, I can't help but think of a question. Let's see. I came across an article on Expert Boxing where it talked about anti-techniques and style. And BJJ Scout's analysis of Dominic Cruz also touched on this. Cruz breaks the rules to his advantage. And he wants to know, basically, do we acknowledge the idea of anti-technique? And if so, are there any anti-style fighters like Eddie's anti-brawler classification for us? Let's touch on the anti-technique thing first. How do you understand that concept, Phil?
So we've sort of seen the question from two angles, right? So Eddie, for example, when we classify Eddie as an anti-brawler, we don't necessarily mean that he's someone who breaks rules. We mean that Eddie is someone who is specifically designed to take down a certain kind of fighter.
Yeah.
He's like a bird-eating spider or something. He is designed to beat up brawlers who have reach parity with him. And in a brief shout out to his 1FC fight this weekend, he's always struggled with fighters who have length and reach on him, for example, who are willing to fight from the outside. But the other way of looking at it, when from the anti-technique perspective, are these guys, is that the way that was mentioned, which is the rule breakers? And yeah, I mean, we do see a lot of these in MMA because it has been such a, wild and crazy sport. There's been some significant disagreement over what is fundamental MMA techniques.
Sure.
But yeah, so I would think there's a few fighters who I think have made their hay by being
awkward.
I was going to say unconventional to the point of weirdness.
Yeah.
I think the most successful one for me is Ben Henderson, because that, as far as his approach goes, there's very little that he does that you would consider classic MMA technique. Almost none of his strikes. He has a decent right hook. His jab is incredibly weird, and he pumps a strange up jab. He's got a solid body kick, but other than that, it's just mostly kind of stomp and front kicks. His takedown game is kind of off kilter. Mm-hmm. He is just but because he's such a well bolted together, he's such a clever guy, and all his techniques have played into each other, then in a lot of cases he's been able to throw off fighters who are, much more functionally, technically sound. I think his last great win was basically the one over Jorge Masvidal, where Masvidal, I think, is a technically superior fighter to Ben Henderson. Mm-hmm. But it didn't really matter because Ben Henderson just cycled through stuff. And Masvidal was constantly trying to, be like, oh, I'm Jorge Masvidal. I like sparring with people and figuring out what they're doing. And he couldn't get a handle on what Henderson was throwing at him.
Yeah, I would say that kind of hits on. I will quickly before I move on to this next point. I hesitate to compare Ben Henderson to Kevin Holland, but both men are very anti-technical from a certain perspective, and both succeed, I think, largely because they're really chill. They don't get stressed out by what's happening. They go with the flow, and that is really, really difficult to do in a fist fight. Is to just let things happen and calmly react to them. In a way that, makes at least a certain kind of sense. So that's another big thing too, is if you're going to have bad technique, you better be cool as a cucumber, or you are going to get that bad technique taken advantage of very quickly. But the other thing is the anti-technique idea seems to apply best against fighters who, how am I trying to say this? Jorge Masvidal is a fighter who wants to figure you out. And that's when that kind of stuff works. I don't think Ben Henderson would have succeeded against Justin Gaethje, for example. What good is anti-technique if the other guy does not care? He's not basing his actions off of what he thinks you might do or trying to counter you. Basically, pressure fighters strike me as the antithesis of an anti-technique fighter. For the most part. Although I guess Dominic Cruz, if we're calling him an anti-technique fighter as well, someone who does a lot of really unorthodox things, his is particularly suited, I think, to fighting aggressive fighters. So
I don't know if we've ever seen Dominic Cruz fight a great pressure fighter, to be honest.
That's true. Yeah. There's Demetrius Johnson before, he was very good at pressure fighting. There's Joe Benavidez, but he was likewise kind of just a bruiser at the time. Yeah, that's true. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting idea. I mean, I will say though, the wheels always fall off at some point. If you cannot base your whole style on just being unorthodox and be consistently successful. It just doesn't usually work. Having fundamentally sound techniques, they work for a reason.
Yeah, I mean, but they work over longer timescales.
Yes,
and that's the thing is that why Jorge Masvidal is because that he knows deep down inside himself that if he just keeps, that his superior technique will win out over these guys over the long term, and he's not willing to abandon that. Meanwhile, Ben Henderson, for example, was just doing weird stuff and consistently racking up points, and Jorge Masvidal was kind of slotting away each one of the things he was trying, thinking oh yeah, how does this one work? How does this one work? How does this one work? Fight's over, you've lost.
It does make me think that there are, like, pretty much all elite fighters do sort of vacillate between the two when it suits them. Like,
yeah,
we talk about a good technique, but like Max Holloway's like karate style blitzes are not good technique. But he does those at the exact right time. He does it when the opponent is breaking under pressure and he needs to follow them and keep that pressure on. So it's like everyone has an element of anti-technique in their game, basically. And what makes you a really great fighter would seem to be how well you balance that against your fundamental technique. Because we've seen Masvidal's unwillingness to break out of his mold hold him back as well. So,
yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Tef, for that question. Next one comes to us from Shane. Shane asks, this may seem like a weird question, but when I watch fights, it seems like you guys see so much more going on. How do I become better at analyzing fights? What should I look for? And how do I see the layers of what's happening? This is a question I think we've answered at least once, or something very much like it in the Dr. Patrick Wyman era of this show. But I think it's always a good question to ask because I really enjoy watching fights the way I watch them. This is like part and parcel of how I enjoy things. And I think the audience for this show are people who enjoy things in a similar way, where you see something that piques your interest and then you want to understand it as best you can. And that furthers and deepens your appreciation for what's happening because you get it. So I think it's always a valid question to answer. Do you have any initial thoughts, Phil, since you've never addressed this question before?
I'm probably going to steal Pat's response.
Wow.
Yeah. I feel like you'd appreciate that.
Biting his whole flow. Yeah, actually,
yeah.
Please steal his response.
Well, I think the important thing is actually not to go too micro. Because when we talk about fights, we might necessarily be talking about, a single technique or what a guy is good at or what a guy is bad at. But instead, I think the first things to look at should be the really like the big level stuff. Try and take a step back from, the punches that are being exchanged and just look at stuff like directionality. Which way does this person like to move? Mm-hmm. What are they actually what does a fighter want to accomplish in a fight? Just trying to think about that from like a slightly zoomed out perspective, because that kind of thing will tend to it will inform the stuff that you see that comes after that. If you just think of where does this guy actually do his work? Is it by the fence? Is it in the open? Does he do it moving forward? Does he do it moving backwards? If you can slot people into kind of larger boxes, mm-hmm. then you can. Once you do that, it becomes easier to just to break them down into smaller ones. Then you can do things that looking at how they respond to different stances, or how they respond to how their footwork works, or any of these other more micro questions. But it's actually pretty easy and relatively easy and quite rewarding just from a basic perspective, just to say how does this guy want to fight?
Yeah, I'm reminded of I used to talk a lot with a guy named Luis Mondo, who's a great trainer in Las Vegas, and he showed me an example of a fight once. God, I wish I could remember it. It was a Joe Goosen fighter, and I'm now forgetting his name. And he fought a guy who was supposed to be the next Floyd Mayweather. I'm forgetting both of their names, even though they're both still somewhat relevant, I think. But it was well, what's happening in this fight was the question. And I watched it all, and I spent so much time trying to pick out all the little technical things. Well, I think this comeback knockout may have happened because of blah, blah, blah. And he was well, really the answer I was looking for is this dude hit the other guy's body all throughout the fight. And the other one didn't have an answer for it. He just kept letting him hit in the body, and by the end of the fight, it was enough that he could come back and knock him out. And that's a much broader stroke than what my brain was able to latch onto at the time. And I think you're right. First of all, there's understanding the why behind, identifying basic broad patterns, and then understanding the why behind, the reasons for why fighters do things. Why do you hit the body? Well, you might do it to open up the head. You might do it to slow the other guy down. You might do it to ward off level changes and takedowns. These are all valid reasons. And once you understand why someone might be doing something, you start to you can see the narratives playing out in the fights as you watch them. And for me, as someone who really likes storytelling and fiction and all of that, like understanding the narrative in a fight is really big for me. Seeing where the story's going, and then you get to see all kinds of unexpected twists and turns too. Once you have a narrative in mind, you don't have to become Joe Rogan and latch onto it. Like, there are answers. And if somebody has an answer for what's happening, they also have a reason for why they're doing that, and the narrative can change. So, like, understanding, the sort of broad flow of the fight while watching it is what I try to do. Does that make any sense as an answer?
Yeah, and it goes right back to the beginning of this episode, which is like, oh, Edson Barboza struggled against wrestlers. It's like, no, he struggled against people who came forward.
Right.
Like, that's a better, more, like it's an even simpler answer than, like, Edson Barboza struggled against wrestlers. Is Edson Barboza struggles against people who push him backwards. Yeah. And it was an easy answer as to why he was going to struggle in that fight.
Because whether or not the guy wrestles, like, they're moving backwards. It's similar to your point about categorization is good. Like, I think that's how human beings understand things as a rule. And so, like, being able to break it down, we get into some really granular stuff on this show sometimes, but, like, once you can separate ideas into broad categories, it becomes easier to break those categories down and make even further distinctions. You can obviously go too far with that and get into the really nitty-gritty weeds where you're not even really talking about real fighting anymore. But being able to break things down, like, that is why I use style archetypes when I analyze fights. That is why I call people pressure fighters or counter fighters or out fighters, because I need to have a broad understanding of where they like to be in the cage and why they like to be there. And once I get that, it's like, okay, now I can I have a basis for understanding what they're doing all the time, whether it's working out for them, whether they're enjoying themselves, and why they're employing certain tactics. Hopefully that answers your question, Shane. And, we have other questions here, but we are already making this episode longer than it needs to be for a card that's supposed to fall on a non-UFC week. So let's go ahead and wrap things up. Phil, before we do you have anything coming out this week? I mean, without a UFC card, I'm kind of expecting the answer to be no.
I do.
Oh my God.
Yes. So at one point a while ago, I think must be a couple of years ago now, I did a piece which looked at the state of each of the divisions in the UFC. And how well they were all working and so on. I can't remember what it was called. It was called something like Divisional Health Check. Mm-hmm. And it ended up saying bantamweight is the best. You should watch bantamweight.
It was various factors like the conveyor belt of contenders, as I recall. Yeah.
So I figured, we've got a bit of a breathing space. It might be time to take stock again. So I'm going to bring it back for 2019.
Sweet. That sounds fun. I'm looking forward to that. As for me, I have noticed a trend recently, which is, this is a trend that's been going on more than just very recently, but little dudes in main events keep knocking out bigger dudes, notably Anthony Pettis and Jorge Masvidal knocking out much larger opponents. And I kind of want to talk about something we've touched on this show before. I did an article on weight cutting and how much I hate it. I want to take a slightly more even-handed approach and talk about the actual costs and benefits of cutting weight, being smaller or larger than your opponents, why it works out, when it works out, and when it doesn't. So just because we've been seeing that lately, and people are like, man, I did not expect Anthony Pettis to be the guy to knock out the dude that Tyron Woodley couldn't knock out. And it happened. Likewise, Jorge Masvidal and Darren Till. Also a dude, Tyron Woodley. Man, Tyron Woodley's exposed. I mean, it has to be said, Phil. He is badly exposed. No, but really. It's an interesting topic. Why do little guys keep knocking out much bigger men? So that'll be it for me. And that's it for this week's edition of Heavy Hands. As we said, next week we will be coming back at you with our breakdown of UFC 236. Max Holloway versus Dustin Poirier will make us strangely and inexplicably sad, but we will do our best to explain that to you when we get to it. Kelvin Gastelum versus Israel Adesanya, two utterly meaningless title fights. That's part of it, but still objectively exciting matchups. So we are looking forward to talking to you about that next week. And until then, if you came here today for the finer points of face punching, wait, Phil, they should find us on Twitter, shouldn't they?
They should do that.
You should find Phil at Evil Greg Jackson and myself at Boxing Bush. And if you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands. Bye.
Smooth as silk.